Hi, welcome to SHOWstudio. I'm Joshua Graham, and today we're going to be using AI to predict Casey Cadwallader's upcoming Mugler show, ahead of the show, which is on Monday.
Yeah.
AI, it's no secret, has been quite controversial, quite divisive in the last couple years. Some people view it in a threatening way as something taking jobs away from creatives. Here at SHOWstudio, we think it's a wonderful tool that more creatives should be utilizing and are utilizing, from the very first AI Fashion Week in New York earlier this year to designers like Edward Crutchley using it to create fun prints. It's a really exciting time. It's a really exciting tool. Before we get into it, I'm joined by two lovely guests who will introduce themselves.
Shall I go? I'm Michael, and I'm the art director here at SHOWstudio. So I use a lot of AI. That's why I'm here to give a perspective on that. But yeah.
Amazing. I'm Omar. I'm an AI artist and creative director. I've been using AI for a few years now, and the last couple of years I've really been seeing how it's manifesting as a creative tool, and I'm a really, really big proponent of every single creative should use it, which I'm sure you're going to hear quite a lot of in a bit.
So Omar joins us again from our previous AI forecasting, which we did on J.W. Anderson, and we kind of unpacked why that brand was so hard to predict, because it's quite eclectic. The references change every season. This time around, we wanted to be quite selective with the brand we wanted to pick. Creative director Casey Cadwallader has been there for a few years now and has really defined his aesthetic and his design language. And he's also at a point in his career where he has created these instantly recognizable codes, culminating in his H&M collaboration earlier this year, which had a lot of those key pieces done for fast fashion. This season, Casey Cadwallader has announced he's shifting away from a see now, buy now way of selling with the upcoming show in Paris. So I thought it would be a really apt brand to pick because there are instantly recognizable motifs, but shifting away from a see now, buy now perspective, I think there's a lot more opportunity to create some fun, show-stopping things that aren't easily produced.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. AI can't predict the future. Big disclaimer, guys.
Yeah.
We're not saying that this is exactly what the show is going to look like. We have no idea what's in Casey's brain. Yeah. What we are doing is using our knowledge of Mugler, of Casey Cadwallader, of the archive, and predicting how it could look, how the references could be reinterpreted and reimagined.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, really important to add, an AI isn't a crystal ball. It's more that we can sort of gather essences from the digital trails that people leave behind on the internet and through the images that make up the data set. Because if we could tell the future with a machine, we'd definitely be doing lottery numbers and everyone would be getting solid gold shoes right now. But yeah.
Oh, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, I can kind of talk on this. This is a really interesting point because, I think what you said about Mugler having such an iconic look and feel under Casey, that trail has been peppered over the internet. And when these AIs are sort of like learning from really big public domain data sets, this essence, while not like directly referenced, is there, and it's almost like seeing shadows and ghosts of what someone may or may not do, but it's almost arriving at Casey's world rather than going, we know what is in his secret mind.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about first steps, really? How do we even combat this, right?
I mean, to be honest, like it's I think it's really important just to sort of just talk about what tools we're actually using, because I think it's always really easy for us to go, we're using AI. I think this time around I really want to go okay, for any creatives listening out there, I think it's really important to sort of go, we in this process did something really unique, which kind of takes it out of the we asked an AI and then the AI said X. We it was a confluence between us, your knowledge, my knowledge of the machine, your knowledge of like all of this entire world sort of gather and braid it together, sort of like create. So visually, you've got things like Midjourney, which you've all have heard of, Stable Diffusion, of course you've all have heard of that as well. And then Llama 2, which is essentially like an open source version of ChatGPT, and that, you know, is what is behind my own AI's brain. But it's really interesting sort of like using not only the sort of like partnership between human and machine, but then the partnership between machine and machine as well. Yeah. And that's really allowed us to sort of, you know, explore in stages and steer the machine in every single direction, which when we sort of like look at the work, we will really sort of like start seeing that come to life.
I think what's interesting about, I think you said, you touched on it last time, you were calling it like AGI, and this idea of AI agents and how you're actually getting the AI to ask itself questions to make better decisions, and that like collaboration is like so key, and it really mirrors the like creative world as well. Yeah. It's interesting how like all the referencing that the AI has to do to make a new product just mirrors how we work as humans to create new art as well. So it's like really is a really good fit, even though there's like the downside but there's a massive upside.
Yeah. So I have to be very honest with you too. I don't really know how AI works. And I'm sure a lot of people don't have really a base understanding or a vague knowledge of how AI works, pulling from images, kind of finding that medium of so much. Can you talk about Alan and the process?
Okay, of course. Yeah. So I think like just to give you sort of like an overview of like how AI works, and I'm just going to talk about the visual one because the word one is way more complicated. The visual one basically is given, you know, it's a machine learning algorithm. It's given really tiny squares of pictures. In this tiny square, which is like 512 by 512, it's labeled what's in this picture. So if it's a beach, if it's a party, if it's a person, all of these pictures are labeled. And these, by the millions, go into the brain of the AI. So it doesn't know what the picture is. It just knows that these pixels mean beach. So when you say, I want a beach made of jelly beans, it goes, oh, jelly bean pixels, oh, beach pixels. Smash them together, jelly bean beach. Yeah. So it's really interesting. Like it's exactly, you know, it feels really similar to like being a creative where it almost feels like you pluck a reference out of thin air and you go, oh, that reference, oh, that reference. I'll put them together to create something new. The machine does that as well, and it does that at a really interesting scale. So that's how like the visual one works. Then Alan, who is my own AI, basically Alan is a language AI, and Alan talks to the other AIs for me. It sounds really weird, but essentially acts like an agent for me. So I figured that because Alan is a machine and the other AI is a machine, they can talk to each other far better than I can. And what Alan was trained on was I gave it, you know, years worth of prompting information and then try to make it rebel against me and all sorts of stuff. But it's really interesting to sort of like start building, I wouldn't say an assistant, or I think it's more like a partnership, a collaboration, and then that just helps unlock new ideas. And, you know, I think that becomes a really interesting place.
I think the interesting point about while we're explaining how the image stuff works is that you can only take things that exist and put them into the brain, and that like is quite key when you're trying to predict the future, is that everything it has to look at is from the past. So it's not like it can't inherently create a brand new fresh idea as you would feel as a human. You can make something that's never existed before. It does have to, it's locked within this realm of referencing the past, and that's kind of why we're saying we can't predict the future truly, because they're not necessarily new ideas, but you could argue that they are, I guess.
Yeah, but then you could also argue that a lot of fashion just plucks from the past and regurgitates it in a new or different way. Yeah. So let's talk about timeline. We started this project just over a month ago, and it really started with conversations with me and Omar about what is Mugler, what defines Casey's aesthetic. I think since he's joined, it's been very bodysuit heavy, it's been very bodycon, and he's really known for his stretch mesh leggings and bodysuits. Where did you start when you were inputting?
I mean, what was really interesting, for me, coming in very blind to having any knowledge about this brand was really good, I think, because I had no inherent biases. So when you told me, when we had our first conversations and, first become educated about what about the brand, it was really interesting because first I was like, you know what, I'm gonna, before I set off any of the machines by telling them anything, I'm just going to ask them to imagine the future. I just plainly just go, tell me what you think Mugler is gonna make. And it ends up with this really corny, cheesy, rehashed place. So then that sort of like process where, that's when the back and forth between us started really, really coming to action. Like, okay, this is what the machine thinks. I mean, we can go into the next slide because it's sort of like, we first then like give Alan this information, and then, I think we just touched on AGI. There's a lot of AGI products available. And what I mean by AGI is like, it's an AI that you can task and it will just do a job for you. So here I said to Alan, like, can you please go and do some research? And I went and did some research. I went and got an ice cream. And then when it came back, it had made 3 core predictions. We then sort of like sat together and sort of like worked through those and tried to see whether they were real. Sorry, not real, but tried to sort of like bring them back into this world and make them make sense. And we can have a look at what those 3 are. And I would love to know what you think about this because...
Okay, so we have as our 3 kind of categorizations of what the AI predicted.
And this is like between us and the AI, like this was, us and Alan together.
So bodycon, paneled bodysuits, sheer paneled corsetry, which I think when you look at like Casey's work, is exactly what it is.
Yeah.
This is like a real kind of signature look for Dominique Jackson from Spring Summer 21. The next category was motorcycling, metal, leather, PVC, and denim. Denim, huge for Casey Cadwallader. Motorcycling, there's a lot of like kind of pulling biker references, and that really comes from Thierry Mugler in the 80s and 90s.
Right, yeah.
So this is Spring 97.
Yeah.
And this with the tires.
Amazing.
It's always wild how accurate it can be. Like, you go like, why would they pull motorcycling? And then you realize there it is like...
It's a reference that even we haven't even like
for
picked
the last
up on.
few years.
But it's also a reference that like Casey's played with at his interpretation of Mugler. So that's pretty interesting. And then the last one is acrobatics, movement, and gym wear, which I think it's, while a lot of Casey's stuff veers in, I think, lingerie territory, I think there's a big proponent of movement in his designs.
Even like the lines, those like classic paneled line stuff is all like a movement thing to give the body movement in. And
this is his last runway show, which was Fall Winter 22, and it's just one example of how much movement plays in not only how he designs, but in how he presents his designs.
This is last season, right? And they did that thing on the track. Cool.
So that's really interesting.
So I mean, as I said, like this is the stuff that first started happening when we didn't really give any of the AIs any visual information, just said, please show us what you think Mugler might look like. And if you imagine the size of their like data sets or the size of these AI's brains, they are vast. They are vast. And when they start connecting these things back together again, it's really interesting because, like I said, I've come quite new to this, so I don't know if this is correct or not. So I don't have the luxury as the artist to go like, oh yeah, this is right, this is wrong. So it's been really interesting to just let the machine breathe out these images.
I think that's really interesting. I think this is, I would say, in the style of Mugler. I think if there was like an H&M or a Fashion Nova in the 90s, they would be looking at what Thierry Mugler was doing with couture and with PVC and all of these maybe unconventional futuristic materials. And somebody would, it feels Mugler inspired.
Totally. I really love the background on all of these. And then I think what was really interesting when we started like giving it insights, one of the things I started asking Alan to do was like, rather than just show me the images, was can we capture the atmosphere of Mugler behind the scenes? And that's what was really interesting, because suddenly it's like picking out these motifs of backstage, of camera equipment, of tripods, of sets being built. And I think there's something really amazing, and that feels like it was quite referencing last year, maybe.
Yeah, I think also that is the key difference in what we did this time around, right? Like last time we were like, let's see what the catwalk looks like. This time it was, let's see what the core idea of the whole collection would be. And actually, like, the catwalk's just the front end of like this whole like idea that makes the catwalk a thing.
Yeah.
I think it's also that thing of like the arbitrary definition of fashion. I think Mugler is a really great brand to look at then and now.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people will view these collections and think, like, who's going to wear that? Where are people going to wear that? But people do. People have responded really positively to this. And I think a big part of it has to do with the marketing and the image making and the feeling and that emotional connection you get from things like the show. Absolutely. So like this is the advert for the H&M collab.
Brilliant.
And a big thing that Casey's done while at Mugler is find female empowerment through hyperfemininity and sexuality, but doing so in a really inclusive and engaging way. So casting is really important, music's really important, tapping into these ideas of cool is really important in selling Mugler more than just like a garment, like leggings.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is also, I think, really difficult to kind of tell a computer to process, like these definitions that are always in flux.
Yeah. I think this was one of my favorite meetings on this like project so far. When like we when we dive into sort of like when we go through all the stages, like stage one when we first sort of showed that was really interesting. We suddenly. I was really blind to it, and you're like, wow, these are all very from the male gaze, and I was like, oh my god. And at that point, I hadn't realized that. Like, unlike a normal camera, we can just like
jump into them.
We can go straight into it. Like when you see these images, which are very, very mid-journey, and are impossible body shapes, impossible beauty, and pretty much everything that is sort of like. Feels like yesteryear, that sort of like the unobtainable beauty or the unobtainable body physique, which suddenly, when you said, actually, what is the gaze from this? And I suddenly started thinking like, wow, like if the machine has been made by majority men who've made these AIs, of course it's going to have this bias. And I hadn't even realized it, because unlike a normal camera, it's the biases of the person who's behind the lens. Yeah. Unfortunately, with AI, is the lens's bias itself. So no matter what image you want to take, it is going to come out biased. So it's been really interesting when we sort of like go to the next bits, but we'll see that. But like we managed to sort of like get past it. But even these, I think, it was really interesting for me looking at these images when it started taking that reference of denim and PVC and colliding them and inventing this brand new material which looks like denim PVC. I'm not 100% sure anyone's going to want to buy that, but it's really interesting when it sort of like has that, what you were saying earlier, like, is there a spark of creativity in the machine? And it almost feels like it's the spark that happens within the viewer, right? Like, if I think that's creative, then it's creative.
Yeah.
If I don't think it's creative, it's not, And I mean, you tell me, like, well, where does this sort of like sit for you? Because it's really interesting. Like,
again, I think this was our first set of images.
Yeah.
I don't think it is very Mugler at all. I think the early ones are. I think they take this idea of like comic book and superhero and camp factor that archive Mugler is really all about. Yeah. But I think with like Casey's is a lot more streetwear inspired. Yeah. There's a lot more sleekness to it. Yeah. And I mean, with gender bias and technology, like the amount of images of women on the internet in general that present women in an overly sexualized way far supersedes like men's depictions. Yeah. So I get why. And why it would be difficult for an AI to kind of differentiate.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things as well, like when I started thinking about this work, was what's happening here is what we're witnessing is the ghost prompts of Midjourney. Like when you use Midjourney, no matter what you prompt in, after you've said something, it will add in what is called a ghost prompt, where it will say something to the AI to make the image better. So you could say cake, but then it will add this entire raft of prompting to make that cake look brilliant.
Right.
So when we're making this work, it was, I tried this really simple way of like going, just typing in Mugler SS24, see what happens. And you can really see like what is the ghost prompt inside Midjourney's brain. Like it is making these things. So theoretically, the bias sits even further back before the image. Like it's going to infect every single image. So it's really important to sort of like go, I think that's why I think stable diffusion is so important, because you can like change it and stuff.
So when you say like they feel really Midjourney,
Yeah.
is that what you mean? Like, is that ghost prompt, that like layer that they've added to make sure that you get a good result?
Yeah, it's a really it's the longer you work in it, it's you can kind of like tell the aesthetic, right? Like Midjourney has a really particular aesthetic, and much like you can tell if you look at enough cameras, you can start telling the film stock, or you can start telling whatever. It's the same with Midjourney images, and that's these are round one stable diffusion videos.
Right.
And they, it was really interesting because I really wanted to start these not from a photorealistic place, to go, well, maybe if we sort of like push this into, like can we come at this from the dimension of being a little bit less realistic and coming from a cartoony space, which I think lended itself quite well, because I think it's really interesting what's happening to the materials, but here comes the bias.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting, the gratuitous depiction of women. But then when we think about like how women are depicted in media in general, it makes sense, unfortunately. And it also opens up this one just feels so superhero pinup. But then I can also see like a lot of the elements in Mugler's work, the use of leather, the kind of angular cutouts.
Yeah, those cutouts in the like abdomen are kind of there, right?
Yeah.
And this was really interesting when it starts going really, really superhero, because really made sense. So up until that point, I hadn't even really thought about, well, what is in the data set? Surely if it's like, I imagine there's a lot of comic books in there, and a lot of other like male media, basically, like and I don't mean that like
but the real truth is that that's not necessarily wrong, because when we look at Archive Mugler, it is that hyper-feminized, hyper-sexualized depiction of the female body, which Terry Mugler has been criticized throughout his career about that campiness. I think today we look at it with more a reverence and celebration of the female form. And I think that's definitely the mood that someone like Casey is doing. So even though he has someone like Earth Eater with barely anything covering her, there's an overall, I want to say, energy, and community and empowerment angle to how he designs and how he dresses these women. I think these are really fun. Again, it's playing with like the futurist elements that Mugler is really known for.
It's like the fan fiction version of Mugler.
Absolutely. That's a really good way of putting it. And I think what's really interesting is like if we imagine it's just like in my head, it always just feels like it's just Mugler from another dimension. And this is just when you start making it with the AI, like it feels like these images are coming from another space. So when you see these, they may very well, they're just an imagination.
So, second batch of images, I think we talked about gender bias. How do we combat that?
I think it was a really, technically it was a really interesting process of first like trying to, it sounds, it was actually quite easy, I'm going to just be honest. So what I did was I basically I realized that I don't really have much of a space to sort of go, well, how can I step outside of my own gaze? Alan can. So I was like, Alan, tell me what is the male gaze and how can we work together to combat it? And one of the things it talked about was the positioning and the framing of the subject. And suddenly, when we then sort of like went through a couple of rounds of prompting and engineering with Alan, suddenly it starts this entire thing of power poses, and it just blew my mind. And also one of the really interesting things about when the model and the clothes fuse with the bikes and fuse with the machines, that sort of like, it's almost like the complete flip of the power dynamics of these images, because suddenly the power of the machine and the power of the woman are the same. So it's a really interesting space that it suddenly sort of started occupying, and then doing stuff like half red, half metallic leather, which just blows my mind.
Yeah. It's interesting that Alan's able to like quantify that for you and go like, I can't think what is actually the problem with these images, but then it's like, yep, this is it, just do that, and it like works so well. And
so this is Alan's interpretation of biking and motorcycle that is really evident in Mugler's work.
So what happened here was Alan took the research that we had like presented to it, and then the research he'd done on its own, and when it started identifying things like motorcycling, it then just sort of like ran with that and just started prompting Stable Diffusion and Midjourney to create these images. And it's been a really interesting experience to sort of like witness, like even this image where it's like cropped the head off the model. It's like, that's on one hand it's really mean that it's done that, but it's a really interesting sort of thing that like it feels really good to let the machine sort of like lead this, because it almost feels like a neutral gaze.
I would say these also feel like so much more real than the previous round. Like the context just feels like something that someone would create rather than draw almost,
I'm hoping a model opens the show on a motorcycle.
Oh my God.
Just like
I could see it happening. Probably won't, but a boy can dream. Clothes-wise, I think these are really interesting. I think, again, it's pulling really from 80s, 90s Mugler and that silhouette, rather than, again, that kind of streetwear angle that Casey's been really into. I will say, going back to ideas of the male gaze, something that both Terry Mugler and Casey do is play with hypermask and hyper-feminine aesthetics and kind of making the masculine feminine. Here is spring 1997. Wow. So while it is a men's tailored jacket, the way it's absolutely molded to this hourglass figure. And Casey does that heavily too, with really broad, big shoulder pads, and again these like mesh stockings. But then the AI, I think, plays a lot more with that male ideal of what masculinity is on a woman.
Did we pick at this stage? Have we picked one of those three and we're going for the motorcycle one, or have you still let the AI?
It's still sort of like exploring all three of them, because the really great thing is like, because Alan can work. Alan can work round the clock, and it's less than I think it's really interesting because rather than converging, it's been a research project, so we have to almost like force it to stay open, because we might miss something if we start killing off roots in this way, which I think is really, again, a really interesting sort of creative process, because normally we couldn't, you're right, we would have to choose one and then just sort of run with that. Whereas now we can go, well, let's just explore more.
That's the great thing about using AI in this way, is that like it removes the barrier to so many things. You're like, actually, I don't have to just pick this one idea. You can just go like, give me a million different ideas, and then we'll review it together later. But
I love this jacket. I think it's really cool. I love
fingers crossed for Monday. Come on. But so I think this is like, is this gone into like, are we into like three? No. This is where it's still sort of like power posy, mega superhero, but like 80s mega superhero. And then you can really, I don't even know like where it was getting these ideas from, but I really love the red and the black work on it, and that idea of movement, like that, I don't know what you call that bit down the front, the sort of like the middle bit of that dress is just amazing. Just blows my mind. But this whole sort of like section feels. It's very sort of like this in particular really feels like realistic anime. Like it's a real anime, like that weird machine in the background. It almost like when we were talking about like what we did last time was like directly look at the clothes. This is way more about the atmosphere and the idea, the sort of like the brand world around it, which I think is super cool.
And I think that's why Casey's Mugler has been really successful, is because like even though I don't think the design language has changed so drastically season after season, he's presenting it in these really fantastic fashion films that just captures a real energy, a real...
I feel like that's a really good thing about Mugler, is that they're still creating this world for you to buy into, and this like backstory, and it's not just like the front end that you see. You get to feel everything very directly. Stage three.
All right. So I think like it does like this. What you're saying, it does like sort of bracket into like motorcycling and all of the other sort of like the three things. But I think now the images are sort of like you've got that realism in there. You've got really interesting. For me, I'm like I don't know. I like the image on the left, for example, the blue, red, and black. Just they look very superhero-y.
very superhero,
Not very spring, summer, right? We're in spring.
Definitely not very. I mean, depending on where in.
I guess which side of the world.
I think it's also interesting that like how much it's picked up on like leather and PVC. Where I mean, I'm not saying that Mugler shied away from that. But the way the AI kind of really.
It's really gone for it. Like. Some of the stuff that you imagine like this is the very, very like tip of the iceberg of the stuff that I could even show you. There's just so much of it, but it's been a really interesting sort of you're right, like the AI has its own obsessions, and to witness it's great because I can then like direct it to say, oh, do you want to like stop thinking about that and maybe think about something else, which you'll see a little bit further down where I was like, please stop doing PVC, dude, just calm down.
It's really, we've been doing some AI here, and like the AI review person, and there are certain things where it just will always do that. You're like telling it like, no, please don't, like, please just give me one sentence instead of like 3 paragraphs. It just like takes like a while to find either the exact wording or something that just goes, okay, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. You're right, like you can have it.
AI is already not listening to us.
Honestly, there's literally a slider where you can say to it like, please do exactly what I've instructed you to, or please don't do what I've instructed you to. And it's really fun to like basically just put it all the way down to like go, all right, you do what you want, because that's when it starts throwing up really interesting things. Because while these may not be what's gonna happen this time, they're like they still are as images arresting and great for a multitude of like future uses.
I love how 80s and 90s it looks. And I think it's really interesting that Casey's H&M collection, they pulled 2 archive looks from the 80s and redid that for H&M. And another reason why I thought Mugler would be so fun to think about, because I think there's a real opportunity for Casey in this upcoming show to further pull from these 80s, 90s codes and references.
They're also, they have you were saying about that they were going from sort of being like, make it as people buy it to this like they're going back to the more traditional fashion selling route where they're going to have a collection and then people order it for their stores and stuff. So they have more room to like do these like 2-tone cuts and things that are less easy to produce, I guess, right? Is that right?
I think so, I think that's exactly, well, I'm sure that's what's going to happen, because I don't see why you would shift away from a see now, buy now, unless you were creating something that just couldn't possibly be produced overnight. And I mean, I'll give it to Casey for really building this distinct design language.
Absolutely.
But I think there is a really huge opportunity to do more huge show-stopping pieces that Mugler was really known for.
Do you think that now that he's made this really solid design aesthetic, which he's managed to get into H&M, he's like, great, tick the box, we can just keep doing that for that sort of area of client, and then I can go back to doing my like the big things that we can spend a little bit more money on and spend a little more time on and sell to the people who want that.
Yeah.
And they've like managed to get the brand into the mainstream, and now they can go back to doing like high end again.
I want to know how much Mugler has made in the last couple of years, because I'm sure it's obscene.
The fragrance, and then H&M, just like absolutely.
No, they're they're everywhere. I also think with the H&M thing,
the M,
because it's so similar to what he's done with ready to wear. To do it again, I think is a tough sell. So again, this opportunity to kind of push the boundaries. Casey, watch this panel and you might be inspired.
But I do think like the average consumer just will, they like you like something, you keep getting it. So if he's like, you just like the McQueen shoe that does not change, you know, that must be still their biggest earner, right? The McQueen like with the thick rim. Just like. They're like, wait, great, we smashed it. Just keep printing those, and we'll do what we want in the background. So that's kind of, I feel like, where he probably is.
I think, so these ones I really wanted to sort of like get your thoughts on, because one of the themes that was coming up with this idea of like really broad shoulders, I think that came up in conversation as well, and the hourglass figure. I left these in here because, you know, these are very mid-journey images as well. Like, we're going to come on to some sort of stable diffusion stuff, which will really show the difference. But you can kind of like, the hourglass figure starts coming out, and the sort of in the middle one. But the broad shoulders and, you know, the one on the left, that sort of corset is a really interesting piece as well. But again, like, these are throwing up really interesting, you know, fizzes.
I don't think this looks like Mugler at all. I think the silhouette is really there. I think both of the designers like played with this 40s tailoring with the strong shoulders and the nipped-in waist, and really exaggerated that to the extremes. This feels, I don't know, a bit random, a bit left field, a bit student collection. And you know what's... Sorry, Alan.
No, honestly, I think it's really important, because, like, you know, when Alan's talking to Midjourney and it's asking Midjourney to make this work, this is from Midjourney. And when you look at these images, like, you can kind of, as the spectator, start seeing what exists inside Midjourney's brain. Because this is what it thinks the world looks like. This is what, when you ask it to do very specific things, like, go away, you know, like, how do we step away from the male gaze, for example, it throws up things like this. So the confusion of, like, you know, well, it makes the sort of like space more confusing, because the machine doesn't talk the same language as us. It doesn't speak the same visual language as us. So it's really, it's just fascinating.
It's cool. It also uncovers our own biases.
I love these images because of how, like, futuristic they are. Again, a big kind of recurring motif for the brand is futurism. This takes it to a very video game almost place. But actually, looking at like this bodysuit, I don't think that's really far off the realm of something Casey would do.
And the set and stuff and the world that it's back in is very editorial, which you can probably imagine them doing, like hypergraphic, stylized, editorial. Walking through the wall is, in the H&M advert, is very superhero. So we're not too far off, I would say, in terms of like essence and like the overall vibe.
These two pictures in particular, I think, are really cool.
I think like these really came out of like when we tried to really push the machine away from making images in the male gaze, and that's why suddenly these images came out, and rather than the sort of like normal mid-journey images of women looking into the camera, they suddenly became these figures, which I think just really reflect, you know, what is the potential of like using a machine. You can make images that you really want.
Also the importance, like, we're not just going like, there you go, do it, amazing pictures, great, thank you very much. It's like actually a lot of work on our side to make something good. You have to tell it it's wrong to make something good.
Absolutely. I think, you know, when you think about like where we started with these images to even these, we've, you know, the sort of like the distance between just raw Midjourney or raw AI stuff to where we are now This is, this is a demonstration of what happens when you add a human back into the machine, and it's amazing. You know?
I think the last kind of conversation we had was about making things a little more realistic.
Yeah.
I think what makes Casey's Mugler very different from Terry's Mugler is the wearability. There's a real kind of streetwear element to how it's styled and how it's designed that feels modern. Like it feels like a modern wardrobe. So this last batch of images kind of played with these ideas and ideas of acrobatics and gym wear. Because that I think is also really rooted in the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this, so you'll see the sort of like jump in image like quality and level from the last lot, which are Midjourney, and this is stable diffusion work. This is open source work. This is stuff that any other creative can pick up and start doing. But I think
so much like Bella.
When this is one of my, I left this in on purpose. Like it is actually blurry because making a machine make a blurry image is very difficult. That's because
crazy,
like it's you can't just like shake the machine while it's doing it because very expensive. But to actually sort of start getting that idea of movement in the machine, you'll start seeing like the extra hand where it doesn't understand movement fully yet, but then suddenly because of that it's bringing out this wonderful new aesthetic, which is a really interesting sort of like space as an image maker to go, well, what happens when we try to add something in it that doesn't exist inside that space?
This feels now so much like a campaign that they could make. Like all the clothes start to feel a little bit more coherent. The vibe of them not actually being on the bike, but like in a moving road, a rolling road, and they're in it very much like the previous campaign's film idea on the track. Like it is actually almost plausible.
And I think the clothing is getting to a place that feels a lot more modern Mugler. But I think different enough that who knows what direction Casey could be taking.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think that's probably the most important thing to say. Like this is just a machine. Like it's like any one of us imagining and being really good at making pictures to go, this is what I think it's going to do. Oh, what do you think? Oh, I think it's going to do this. Like it's our machine doing the same sort of thing.
But that's the thing, right? It's like we could have the same discussion and we could be like, okay, we think it's going to be like this, and then you take like a month to go and make that image. But the difference is you go like, we think it should be like this, and then 20 seconds later you go like, yep, is that good? No? Okay, do another one. And it's like that time to product is like so much shorter, and like that is the best thing about it.
Yeah. And you can like you can iterate so many new ideas over and over again. Like there's a couple that started doing this. I think I took most of them out, but this sort of like weird metal chest piece, which I was like, it doesn't feel, I mean, I don't know for you whether it feels superhero-y or not, but for me it doesn't feel Superman. It feels way more like jewelry.
And I think in like the last couple of shows, Casey has played with these metallic motifs because Terry Mugler did those like motorcycle 3D handlebar corsets and these futuristic like space robot couture outfits. But he has also taken elements of that and modernized it and made it maybe not the focal point. So I think that's a really interesting direction.
Amazing.
Yeah, they are really good. Like, this is a full campaign now. This is like the same idea, the same world in every picture. Like
for the new Eau de Parfum.
This was really interesting because it started making denim jumpsuits, and I was like, I have to leave this in there because is this gross or is this not gross? I don't know. But it's really interesting because when it started like doing this, like, mesh is a really, really difficult material to sort of like replicate in a machine because it doesn't really understand what mesh is. So, the image at the bottom there with the collarbones starting to show through the mesh and the leather just on the sides was, it was a really interesting moment to like go, wow, what happens when we start concentrating on not just the being, but the sort of like the structure of the being. So when I'm describing this to the machine, it's actually pulling way more information out about the human. So that's why these images have that like weird quality, like the extra fat in the cheeks, and the sort of like the indentations on the forehead.
That feels like so they're just like, and honestly, like also the tech upgrade since last time we've had like Stable Diffusion XL came out, which is like the Mid-Journey competitor on the open source side, and it's just like every few months just a massive leap, and like
I think
on newer and newer images, trained on bigger. So you said the 512 pixels by 512 pixels. Now it's like 1024 now. So the more detail in the training, and like more. So yeah, it's just like, who knows where it goes,
Absolutely. And when you think like exactly when we spoke last time, they were very sort of like wonderful Mid-Journey images, but obviously trained on econ pictures, and we're like, hold on a minute, that's really interesting. But then with these ones, it's been really interesting to sort of like add that element of acrobatics back into it to make the machine sort of like
capture an energy.
And I think that energy is what's really difficult to capture inside a machine. But I mean, it's difficult because we haven't spent that much time doing it, but as it sort of opens up to go, how can more people do this? How can more creatives pick up these machines and go, I want to make something that makes me feel sad when I look at this image, or actually has an emotive reaction and an emotive quality to it, which
I think you really get, like Michael said, these feels like a campaign. There's a real palpable energy to the movement in these images, and I think that really helps sell the clothes, because I think this is probably the best set of images that we've looked at.
And like so much more interesting and descriptive than just a straight like catwalk shot.
It also feels a lot more, I think, considered. Like it's like the AI kind of condensed ideas, whereas those early images were an amalgamation of absolutely everything that it was able to consume.
Interesting.
So Casey Cadwallader a couple days ago on Instagram showed a sneak peek of a pair of shoes, and that the collection was going to have new Mugler shoes. So what fun that we could get Alan to predict some Mugler-esque heels.
Amazing. Like the one thing that I really want to say about these, like while it was super fun to make these, the see-through PVC shoe with a denim sock, I had to leave that in there because I couldn't think of anything grosser than that. But it's really interesting because, while a lot of the work that people, especially AI artists, are doing is really sort of practicing, you said like AI Fashion Week, there's very few who are really concentrating on making shoes and making, images of trainers. And, why that's interesting is because data sets exist for faces and bodies and humans and clothes, etc. There's not that many data sets that are like, specifically shoes. So you will really start seeing like the shoes have a skeletal, they have the same skeleton. No matter what you do, they keep repeating the same skeleton. So it was really interesting while it's building on top of it, and it's got PVC and it's got metal and it's got these really interesting materials. They won't deviate too far away from it unless they get very futuristic like this.
Okay, I will say, these I don't feel are far off from something Terry Mugler would create. Whether or not Casey would go full camp factor is to be determined. We'll have to tune in on Monday.
Let's do that,
Cool. And then these more futuristic kind of like trainers and boots, which are also fun.
That feels like something, this like metallic on the left, I can't remember the actual brand, but there's like, it's interesting that it's just like, they just look like shoes. Shoes just look like shoes,
The one at the bottom was an interesting image, right? So forget about the spikes for a minute. The thing that was really interesting about that image was the size and width of the heel. I've never seen a shoe like that, so that's why I had to leave that in there, because I was like, wow, like, why are you thinking that for? I mean, I know it would be super awkward to walk in it, but it really just made me think like it's a really interesting design choice, because I can't imagine a human making that design choice on purpose.
I mean, I don't think it's far off the realm of possibility for what Mugler could do. Will that be the case? I'm not sure. So that's everything we had. Closing thoughts on this exercise, on this experience ahead of the show?
I mean, obviously we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where it's going to go. But I think we've definitely got to a way more coherent sort of result. And it feels more like a plausible idea rather than just a bunch of suggestions.
Yeah.
And just like proving the quality of what you can get from AI and like the use of it, the use case of it.
Yeah.
Like being able to go through so many iterations in just a month. Like obviously some of the creative directors have to work like that, but having the option to go like, let's try all of these ideas and then we'll pick the best one at the end.
Yeah.
Rather than let's go down one is like sort of the selling point of AI, right? It's like closing the gap between your abilities and your ideas and bringing them both together and being like, I can just make what I want to see.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. I think that's a really kind of great way to look at this exercise.
Yeah.
Because we did kind of pinpoint an aesthetic that feels very relevant to what Casey has done at Mugler, from something that was, again, just this mishmash of huge ideas.
Yeah.
I do want to say, I think the one thing, we did talk about gender bias, but there's also a lack of diversity. There's a huge lack of diversity. A big selling point of Casey's Mugler is its inclusivity. Having trans models, having models transcend age, having all kinds of gender expressions and body sizes is so important to selling what Mugler is today. That, I mean, it does suck that it's not the standard for AI to also view the world in that kind of inclusive space.
Absolutely. I think that for me is like one of the, it's been an amazing process to witness, adding humans and machines together to create this work. I think to your point, what's been really interesting is like, it almost feels now the work starts to reverse that bias or to sort of do something about it. It's, as creatives, we can make these models, we can make AI models, so we could, in theory, create a very non-biased model or a very non-gendered model or a model that sees the world in a really particular way. So I think that is going to be, I mean, for me, that feels like what's going to be a really important task for next time. We go, right, guess what? This one doesn't think anything.
But also just like the importance, it highlights the importance of making an effort to actively do it, because otherwise you do shift down this very directed gaze, and then in like 5 years when everything's AI, it's this very specific idea has just propagated into everything. So doing the work. Because it sounds so like big, but doing the work now is like.
And I mean, it's up to everyone who uses AI the same way it's up to everyone who uses Web 2 and the internet is we have to check our biases with everything we do and everything we upload online.
And to your point, like the way that these machines work, it will just industrialize inequality in a way that we just will never grasp. So it's so important for us to pick these tools up and go, let's make something completely different. And it's a YouTube tutorial away, basically.
Anyone can do
Anyone can do it. Please do it.
Please go.
I'll race you.
Amazing. So whether or not these are going to be on the runway with the upcoming show, who knows? But this was really fun. Thank you so much, Omar, for coming in. And thank you, Michael, for giving your expert input. And thank you, audience, for joining us and talking about AI. And we'll see you next time.